My name is Ernest Opines, and for 42 years I sold paper goods across the lower half of Arkansas and into northern Louisiana. It was a living, and an honest one, though not the sort of trade that leaves statues behind. I knew every office manager from Hamburg to Bastrop by their first name and their preferred brightness. I could look at a ream and tell you if it would jam a copier before the copier knew it. Folks imagine sales as talk. Most of it is listening. Listening for the moment when a man admits he'd rather not have to think about paper again for the rest of his life, and you assure him you can make that dream come true. Now, at 67, I am what they call retired, a condition I find agreeable only when it is understood not as an end to labor, but as a reallocation of it. My energies, once devoted to the relative merits of 20-pound bond versus 24, are now directed toward more edifying pursuits. I record those in a weekly column for the Ashley County Eagle, titled, as you might guess, Uncle Ernest Opines. The word opine has lost currency. I keep it alive out of stubbornness and the belief that a county is measured, in part, by the dignity of its verbs. My present passion is ornithology, a field that rewards a certain temperament, the patient, the observant, the cheerfully underprepared. Birds are best met on their terms, in the weather they prefer, the light they choose, at the hour most other creatures, including men, regret. The bird I wanted was the red-cockaded woodpecker, a small, particular citizen of the longleaf and loblolly pines who insists on living in living timber and has suffered for the insistence. It is not the bird of postcards, but it is a bird that repays attention. The destination was the Felsenthal National Wildlife Refuge, 65,000 acres of bottomland hardwoods and upland pine stitched together by sloughs and patience. The federal government drew a line around it in 1975, but the land had been drawing lines for centuries. River bends, sand blows from old earthquakes, faint tram grades where the Dorado and Bastrop once hauled trees towards cross its appetite. When men quit a place, the trees keep their own minutes. If you walk slow, you can read 'em. The plan, arrived at with a compass, a topographical sheet, and a modest argument with technology, was simple enough. I would haul my new Hyundai Pioneer 1000 behind my 2018 Tacoma TRD off-road as far as the gravel allowed, then take the side-by-side down the overgrown bed of the El Dorado and Bastrop tram line, aiming for a patch of upland pine rumored to hold a family group of red-cockadeds. I allow that rumored is not a scientific term, but I have found that good rumors are often maps with the label smudged. Some might say a man in his late 60s has no business piloting a machine into the bottoms alone. These are generally the same people who think adventure is something you can add to a shopping cart. My feeling is that a life spent in careful increments, cases, invoices, miles between clients, earns a man the right to miscalculate in the direction of wonder. Besides, this was no impulsive lark. I had a thermos of coffee strong enough to dissuade doubt, a pair of Bushnell 10x42s that hold focus better than most of my acquaintances, a silver Ranger compass that does not flatter you when you're wrong, and a pack heavy with practicalities, sandwiches and wax paper, a rolled map, a flashlight that claims to be waterproof and has not yet been asked to prove it. It began, as most serious undertakings do in Ashley County, with a map stretched across a kitchen table and a pencil tapping the spots where roads turned suggestive. I drew a thin line from the boat ramp south of Huttig, up through a web of old timber spurs, over a covert I remembered from a catfish trip in '86, and along a straight scar the satellite insisted was the tram bed. The satellite is an honest enough guide, but it leaves out the important part, what it feels like when the crown of the road disappears and the pines lean in close enough to hear your thinking. People ask why a man would go to such trouble for a bird that weighs less than an ounce. I could quote conservation doctrine or deliver a lecture on keystone species, but the truth is nearer and less noble. After 4 decades of paper, I wanted to follow a sheet back to its source, not to the mill, with its doctrine of steam and schedules, but farther upstream to the tall, straight pines where something taps 3 times and the forest answers with sap. If a paper salesman is to confess anything at the end, he ought to confess that the tree had the first word. Felsenthal, being federal, has signs. They present a confident face, boundary markers, rules about fires and dogs, encouragements to respect the fragile. I respect all that, but the refuge also has the older signage, the limbs that point where wind teaches them, the paler stripe of soil where water argues its case, the narrow, ruler-straight strip of higher ground that tells you men once ran iron here in a hurry. When the engine cuts, the woods say what the signs meant. My purpose was not a joyride. It had a graphic and educational aim, as I put it in my notebook. Graphic because I meant to bring back a photograph of Picoides borealis as proof to myself that attention still pays a dividend. And educational because a county that forgets how to read its own trees has surrendered more than shade. I had no illusions of rarity fame. The red-cockaded is not the ivory bill. It has the decency to exist. But it does require a man to step off pavement and make a compact with quiet. Before daylight, I fueled the Tacoma at Pruitt's and endured the usual questions about where and why. I tried to explain about trees of a certain age and the moral improvement that comes from locating a bird precisely where a biologist once drew an arrow. The girl at the register nodded the way people nod at an uncle who is tolerated for his money and forgiven for his theories. She said, "Be careful," which was sound advice, poorly suited to my plan. Driving south, the world commits to forest in increments. Cross its stacks, draw their breath. The last street light stutters out behind you. Then the highway shoulders slacken, and the ditches become small rivers rehearsing for flood. A fog comes up from the bottoms that has its own calendar. Deer read it. So do men who remember what a slowdown looks like from a pulpwood cab. I followed the familiar asphalt till the familiar ended, then gravel till gravel thinned to 2 ruts, then ruts till even intention had to admit it was now a path. There's a moment, sitting in a parked truck at the edge of such places, when cowardness and prudence hold a brief meeting. In that meeting, they often agree to call the whole thing off. On this morning, however, the Hyundai Pioneer announced its opinion with a cheerful, slightly insolent bark, and the matter was settled. I rolled it down the trailer ramps, locked the Tacoma, and felt that peculiar lightness that happens when you leave the last key you possess inside a machine you can't see from where you're going. The plan, the gear, the route were all sound enough to satisfy a retired salesman and to fool a birder. I can't say what else I expected to find beyond the woodpecker and the quiet. I will say only that when a man goes looking for a small, exacting bird in a big and different forest, he ought to be prepared for the forest to take an interest. And if the forest is in the mood to answer, it will not be in the language you had planned to hear. So I ventured out for a reasonable cause, one I could justify to a wife, a banker, and the part of myself that keeps a ledger. I went because attention is a form of gratitude, and because some things, once scarce, can only be honored by being found. I went in with a compass, a map, a side-by-side, a thermos of coffee, and the modest hope of a photograph. It was, I told myself, a sound reason to venture out. What I had not accounted for, what no prudent introduction can admit without seeming unserious, was how quickly a sound reason becomes a story, and how a story once started in the bottoms insists on traveling farther than the map.
A man entering the wilderness unprepared is a fool tempting fate, and I have never aspired to be a fool. The Felsenthal bottoms do not welcome improvisation. They reward forethought, planning, and a healthy respect for what lies beyond the county-maintained road. My preparations for the venture were therefore meticulous, the way a man arranges his life before venturing into unknown country. It is one thing to sell paper from Crosset to Bastrop. It is another thing entirely to track the ghost of a woodpecker through the last remnants of its chosen forest. I began assembling my gear a week before the trip. There is a ritual pleasure in such arrangements, a satisfaction born of order. My dining table looked like an inventory of practical modesty. A pair of Bushnell 10x42 binoculars, a silver Ranger compass with its base plate polished clear, a laminated topographical map that had once belonged to a Forestry intern, a Stanley thermos filled with coffee brewed black and bitter enough to qualify as medicinal, and a revolver, a Smith Wesson Model 10, that rested in its holster like an old friend. The revolver, contrary to the expectations of those who equate firearms with bravado, was not for hunting. I have always believed that a well-maintained gun, like a well-maintained conscience, exists best when untested. Its presence was more philosophical than practical, a talisman against the unknown, a reassurance that one's hands, however trembling, are not entirely empty when faced with mystery. Black bears, coyotes, even men of ill intent, such possibilities do not frighten me so much as the feeling of being unprepared. 2 pimento cheese sandwiches wrapped in wax paper completed the essentials. My wife would have preferred I carry something more substantial, but sandwiches made at dawn carry a kind of virtue. The simplicity of them, white bread, sharp cheese, and mayonnaise, reminds a man that life, like lunch, can be sufficient without flourish. My conveyance to the drop-off point was a 2018 Toyota Tacoma TRD off-road, a truck I have come to regard as the finest expression of modern utility. It is not ostentatious. It is not the sort of machine that demands admiration from strangers at gas stations. It simply does its job. I've driven it through knee-deep mud, along gravel-cut banks, and atop timber roads forgotten since the Depression. The truck is built with purpose, a sharp contrast to certain domestic models that seem designed by committees of people who have never had to change a tire in the rain. The Tacoma's hum is steady and self-assured, the kind of hum a man can think to. On this particular morning, its bed carried a small single-axle trailer, upon which was strapped my pride and joy, a Honda Pioneer 1000 side by side. I debated this purchase for months, the way some men debate religion. I justified it as a field necessity, an instrument of exploration, a bridge between civilization and wilderness. But the truth is simpler. It was something I wanted. After 42 years of justifying everything to balance sheets, I felt entitled to at least one impractical practicality. The Pioneer, with its narrow wheelbase and high suspension, is well suited to the forgotten tracks that crisscross southern Arkansas. The old tram lines, built by the El Dorado and Bastrop crews a century ago, were not meant for trucks or SUVs. They were the veins of the timber trade, iron rails laid through the heart of the forest to bleed it of its virgin pine. Once the trees were gone, the tracks were pulled, leaving only the faint impression of human intent, a straightness that nature has not yet forgiven. Driving south along Highway 425, I fell into the rhythm of the road, the small thud of the hitch, the steady hiss of tires on asphalt, and the rising brightness of a morning that promised neither mercy nor malice. The radio was off. Conversation was unnecessary. I thought of the men who had built that tram bed 100 years ago,
Immigrants and farm boys armed with crosscut saws, working under the command of foremen who measured their worth in board feet. They were not bird watchers. They were industrialists in overalls, conscripts at commerce, feeding the great appetite of the Crossett Lumber Company. In their time, the forest was a crop to be cut and shipped, its future left to chance and regrowth. Yet here I was, decades later, driving into the same forest to find a bird that needed the very trees those men had felled. History, it seems, is a circle drawn with a crosscut. I wondered what they would make of a man like me, an aging salesman with a camera, a map, and a guilty fondness for the product of their labor. At a pull-off near the refuge boundary, I parked the Tacoma, stepped out, and listened. The sound of the engine faded into the immense quiet of the bottoms, a quiet so complete it felt like a living thing. The air was dense, full of the smell of pine pitch and damp earth. Somewhere far off, a woodpecker struck 3 deliberate notes, as if to test the air for resonance. I felt in that moment both the smallest and the luckiest man alive. I unloaded the Pioneer carefully, tightening each strap before unhooking it from the trailer. I have learned ritual attention, checking, rechecking, is the difference between adventure and ordeal. The machine touched the ground with a soft, satisfied sigh. Its engine barked once and settled into a deep, confident hum, like a dog that knows its way home even in strange woods. The plan was simple. I would take the tram line south, cross a small creek shown on the topo map, and stop at the second ridge to begin glassing the canopy. The red-cockaded woodpecker prefers mature stands where open pine crowns and sunlight meet. I hope to find that rare combination, photograph the bird if fortune allowed, and be home before dark. But the woods, I have learned, have a habit of revising plans made in comfort. As I stood beside the idling Pioneer, I felt a twinge of anticipation, part curiosity, part something older and unnamed. Men who spend their lives in towns forget that silence has texture. Out there you can feel it, woven with distance, folded with time. I climbed into the driver's seat, adjusted my hat, and looked once more at the map folded on my knee. The line was faint but true, and the morning was still young. So began my venture into the Felsenthal bottoms. It was, at that moment, a perfectly reasonable plan, executed by a perfectly ordinary man in possession of all necessary tools. I did not yet know that reason, once loosed in the wilderness, often finds companies stranger than sense.
There is a particular stillness to the woods before full daylight, the sort that presses on a man's chest like an unspoken question. I stood for a moment beside the Honda Pioneer, listening to the world breathe. Somewhere a barred owl gave its last hoot of the night shift, and a whippoorwill announced the changeover of the morning. Mist hung in tatters along the low ground, catching on the high brown grass and vanishing as the sun climbed. I backed the Pioneer off the trailer, secured the Tacoma, and began my journey down what had once been the Dorado and Bastrop tram line. It wasn't much to look at from the highway, just a ragged gap in the tree line. But once you slipped into it, you could feel its intention. The straightness was unnatural. Even after a century of disuse, the line still held its course like a memory the forest had agreed to keep. The first few hundred yards were easy going. The ground was firm, covered in the papery rustle of pine needles and oak leaves. The trail wound between stands of sweet gum and hickory before leveling into a long, unbroken corridor. It had the uncanny symmetry of an old road reclaimed, shoulders feathered with moss, ditches filled with ghost water. My tires crunched over the brittle skeletons of leaves, the sound echoing in that enclosed space. The Felsenthal bottoms have their own geography of sound.
The deeper you go, the quieter it becomes. Not the soft quiet of a Sunday porch, but the deep resonant hush that belongs to places beyond convenience. Even the wind changes character here. It doesn't rush, it drifts. It carries the smell of pine pitch and river mud, the faint sweetness of decaying oak. Every few minutes I'd cut the engine and let the silence fill back in, like watching water settle after a stone's been thrown. The forest west of Bayou Bartholomew is a country divided between two worlds. To the east, the land flattens into the delta, a patchwork of fields and drainage ditches. But west of the bayou, you find the timberlands, a quilt of ridges, sloughs, and hardwood bottoms stitched together by the patient hand of erosion. The land here has texture. It swells and sinks like a held breath. The tram bed carried me through that shifting terrain. In the low places where the ground sank toward the water, the hardwoods ruled. Overcup and oak arcs with bases as wide as kitchen tables, their roots braided into the black mud. Sweet gum, water hickory, and ash filled the gaps between. In some hollows, I passed stands of buttonbush so thick you could lose a man in them. The trunks of bald cypress and tupelo rose like pillars from the still pools beside the trail. Ancient trees whose knees jutted up through the water like the fingers of something buried alive. But then the ground began to lift. The bottoms gave way to pine ridges, and with each rise the world grew brighter and drier. I could feel the change through the tires, the give of loam replaced by the firmness of sandy clay. These ridges are the hidden spine of Ashley County. Small elevations that have saved countless hunters and wanderers from drowning or despair. The men who cut the tram knew their business. They built along the dry veins of the land. Up on the ridge, the hardwoods thinned until I was surrounded by loblolly pine. They rose straight and unbending, 60 feet or more, their trunks bare until the very top where the needles fanned out like distant fireworks. Sunlight filtered in slow gold stripes, catching on the dust kicked up by the tires. There's something almost religious about a pine stand like that. The smell of resin and heat, the sound of the wind combing through the needles, it makes a cathedral of the woods. I stopped and killed the engine. The silence that followed was complete. The world seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere to my right, a red fox moved through the understory, its tail a flash of rust against the pale needles. I kneeled and studied the tracks left in a patch of soft dirt. Deer, raccoon, and the small, perfect prints of a wild turkey. It struck me how all of these creatures had crossed the same invisible threshold I had, following the same instinct toward quiet necessity. Far overhead came the sharp cry of a Cooper's hawk, cutting through the stillness like a clean tear in fabric. It was a living punctuation mark, an exclamation in the grammar of the forest. The hawk's voice faded, and for a long time there was nothing, just the hum of insects and the slow drip of condensation from the pine needles above. I took a long swallow from the thermos, the coffee scalding but steadying. My hands, which had once written invoices and shaken hands in fluorescent offices, now held something worth the burn. There's a satisfaction in drinking coffee made bitter on purpose, the kind that sharpens the edge of your thoughts. I thought of the bird I sought, the red-cockaded woodpecker, and how particular its requirements were. Mature pine, open canopy, minimal undergrowth, a forest old enough to remember, yet managed enough to survive. A paradox, much like the people who live in its shadow. Every tree had a story of endurance carved into its rings, though none would tell it easily. I considered, not for the first time, that perhaps my search for the bird was less about sighting it than about learning to see the forest differently. To trace the long arc from cut-over wasteland to the deliberate renewal of these managed stands. The Crosset experimental forest just north of here had proven that such things were possible. The regeneration was not a dream, but a discipline. Somewhere behind me, a woodpecker struck, a quick, deliberate series of taps. I froze. My heart caught in that ancient rhythm of pursuit and hope. But when I lifted the binoculars, I saw only the empty bark of a pine glinting where sap had bled through. Whether it had been the bird I sought or one of its less notable cousins, I couldn't tell. Still, the sound lingered in the air, bright and promising. I noted the location on my map, folding the paper carefully along its old creases. The tram bed stretched ahead of me, a narrow seam between ridges. The sunlight fell in long, slanted shafts, and the day was warming quickly. My next goal was a small creek crossing where the map showed a widening, perhaps a good place to stop, rest, and make a few notes. I climbed back into the Pioneer, started the engine, and felt the machine come alive under my hands. The hum of it was comforting, a reminder that I still belonged, however tenuously, to the modern world. The woods accepted me as an interruption, polite, temporary, tolerated so long as I moved quietly. And so I drove deeper, following that old ghost of a railroad through the heart of the Felsenthal bottoms. I did not yet know what waited for me on the far side of that creek, only that I was going somewhere no salesman's map had ever promised, and the reason, once set in motion, has a way of finding company in the most improbable places. After an hour of steady progress, I came upon a small clearing where the tram bed intersected a dry tributary creek, its sandy bottom gleaming faintly through a tangle of buttonbush and vines. The place had that comfortable, provisional look of a natural rest stop. Flat ground, just enough shade, a whisper of water beneath the sand. I decided it would do for coffee. I cut the engine, and the forest closed in around me like the theater after the lights drop. It's remarkable how quickly the absence of sound becomes sound itself. The breath of wind through pine crowns, the faint settling of dust on metal, the long, elastic sigh of trees remembering how to stand without vibration. I poured a cup of coffee from the thermos, the lid's faint click sounding louder than I intended, and leaned against the side of the Pioneer. The world felt ancient and new all at once. A black and white warbler zigzagged through the understory, and somewhere off to the north a wood duck gave its strangled whistle. It was all proceeding according to the kind of quiet plan that makes a man think he's the only one to ever find the place. Then I heard it. It began low, a hum at first, felt more than heard, like the tremor that precedes a storm. The coffee sloshed in its cup and I froze. The sound rose into a steady whine, unmistakable to anyone who's lived within the range of the timber trade. A chainsaw. Another joined it, then a third, forming a discordant choir of two-stroke fury. A moment later came the metallic thump, hiss of hydraulics, and the slow groan in protest of something immense being persuaded to the ground. I stood absolutely still, my first thought being that I had somehow wandered outside the refuge boundary. But the map in my pocket disagreed. The coordinates were clear. I was well within the designated protection area of Felsenthal National Wildlife Refuge. That fact carried with it a rising civic irritation that boiled over into moral offense. Timber thieves. It was the only explanation that made sense. Men with machines who, through ignorance or greed, saw not the sanctuary of an ecosystem, but an unguarded inventory. The thought of it struck me in the chest like a thrown wrench. I had spent my life making peace with the industrial appetites of humanity, selling the byproduct of trees to men who never thought about trees, but this was different. This was trespass against the very principle that made Felsenthal worth protecting. I tried to measure distance by the sound. The chainsaws came in overlapping bursts, one close, another deeper, followed by the unmistakable clatter of limbs hitting metal. Whoever they were cutting with method, not recklessness. The rhythm was too even, too professional. A single amateur with a poolin can make more noise than a storm, but this was an orchestra. I set my coffee down, took up the map, and marked the direction roughly southeast. The wind was with me. If I followed the slope of the ridge another half-mile, I reckoned I'd come upon the source. There was no question of whether to go, only how quietly I could do it. The bottoms are not built for stealth. Every stick, every dry leaf, every inch of that forest seemed to exist for the purpose of announcing intruders. I moved slow, placing each foot with the kind of deliberation reserved for men in high places or dangerous company. The smell of sap grew stronger. I could feel the vibration now, not through the air but through the ground itself. When I reached the crest of the ridge, I dropped to my stomach and crawled the last few feet through pine straw. From there, the view opened like a wound. Below me stretched a broad, freshly cut landing, 2 acres of raw earth shaved clean of brush. At the center sat a knuckle-boom loader, his hydraulic arms swinging in patient arcs, lifting, sorting, and stacking logs with an efficiency both admirable and unnerving. The machine hissed and groaned like a great mechanical insect, its motion so smooth they seemed choreographed. Beside it, a delimber stripped branches from trunks with ruthless precision, the sound of tearing wood alternating with the wet slap of bark. A crew of men in hard hats and reflective vests moved through the operation. They were not the rough-edged desperados I had imagined, but trained workers, each focused on his role. Chainsaws were shut down as logs were measured, tagged, and rolled into neat piles awaiting transport. The scene was as orderly as any legal job I'd ever witnessed. And yet I knew in my bones that this work was out of place. The realization came slow, like the creep of heat under the collar. This was not theft done in the dark. This was daylight precision, carried out with pride. I counted 4 men, maybe 5, and a waiting Peterbilt log truck parked at the far edge of the clearing. Its cab gleamed red under the filtered sun, chrome polished to vanity. And then I saw him. He stood apart from the others near the loader, gesturing with an ease that marked authority. He was enormous, so tall that he seemed out of scale with his surroundings. For a moment I assumed he was standing on something, a stump, a block, a trick of perspective. But when he stepped forward, the ground itself seemed to make room. I lifted my binoculars. The image sharpened, then steadied. The man, or what I still believed to be a man, wore a fluorescent yellow-green safety vest stretched across a frame that would have made a linebacker look underfed. His eyes were covered, not with a hard hat, but with a dark thatch of hair that so thick it absorbed the light. His arms, visible beneath rolled sleeves, were covered in the same. His movements were fluid, deliberate, almost graceful, as though strength were something he carried without effort. I lowered the binoculars, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The image did not change. My mind did its usual trick of reason, a prank, a costume, a mistake of light, maybe a welder's mask, maybe a shadow. But the longer I watched, the less room there was for explanation. The foreman turned, the side of his face catching the sun, and I saw features that were human only by degrees. A heavy brow, a flat, broad nose, a jaw too deep for proportion. The hair that covered him was not matted or savage, but neatly kept, like fur made respectable. I sat back on my elbows, heart thudding in my chest, and whispered the only words that made sense. "That is no man." Below, the saws paused. A loader horn sounded twice. The great figure raised an arm, massive, calm, commanding, and the crew responded instantly, shutting down their machines. The silence that followed was deeper than before, a silence that felt deliberate. I felt my pulse climb into my throat. My instinct said retreat, but something older, some strange, unbidden curiosity kept me still. I watched as the figure turned toward the ridge, his head tilting slightly as though he had heard something I didn't mean to say. And then, impossibly, he began to walk toward me.
I lay there on my stomach in the pine straw, squinting through the binoculars. And for a long moment I couldn't quite convince myself that what I was seeing belonged to this world. The sun was high enough now to burn away any illusions of shadow or trick light. The clearing below was broad and deliberate, a proper landing. The kind of sight planned with GPS precision and experience measured in generations. What unsettled me was not the activity itself, but the scale of it, the sense that this place had been hidden, purposeful, and waiting. The first thing that caught my attention was the order. This wasn't some fly-by-night poaching outfit. It was a functioning timber operation, disciplined, clean, almost elegant in its efficiency. The ground was rutted but not ravaged. The skid trails radiated like spokes from the landing, each carefully placed to minimize soil disturbance. Piles of limbs and slash were stacked neatly for later chipping or burning. I had spent a lifetime selling the end product of this work, paper, cardboard, envelopes, and yet I had never stood close enough to smell the heat of the machinery that made it possible. A knuckle boom loader, painted a fading shade of yellow, sat at the center of the landing like a mechanical spider. His hydraulic arm swung in rhythmic precision, plucking trunks from the ground and laying them onto a waiting stack with almost tender care. Beside it, a pulled-through dilemma sang its metallic song, clattering and rasping as it stripped branches from pine stems and long, wet ribbons. The air was thick with sap and diesel. The men worked with an economy of motion that comes only from long familiarity. No wasted steps, no unnecessary shouts. They moved between the machines like a pit crew, one feeding, one sorting, one tightening a chain on a saw that had cut more wood this morning than most men do in a season. I counted 4 of them at first, then a 5th near the loader, gesturing upward with his hard hat. It was a scene I might have admired had I not been convinced it was illegal. I scanned the area again, searching for markings or signage, anything to indicate they were legitimate. There were no company trucks, no visible permits, no posted boundary signs. It was as if this whole operation existed in a pocket of plausible deniability. My indignation swelled. I'd come looking for a woodpecker and found industry alive and humming inside a federal refuge. And then I saw him. He stood just beyond the loader, talking to one of the men, his voice inaudible but his authority unmistakable. Even from this distance, his sheer size dominated the scene. He wore the same fluorescent safety vest as the others, but on him it looked like a napkin trying to pass for a shirt. He must have been 9 feet tall if he was an inch, broad across the chest, shoulders like the hood of a truck. His posture was easy, almost casual, but his presence bent the scene around him. At first, I thought he must be standing on something, a stump perhaps. But when he moved, stepping down into the sunlight, the truth of it struck me in the gut. There was no stump. The ground seemed to yield beneath him, and yet he walked with the balance of someone who knew every inch of it. I raised the binoculars again. What filled the lens made my scalp prickle. The face was unmistakably humanoid, but wrong in all the ways that mattered. The brow was low, the jaw square and enormous, the nose broad and flat. The hair was dark, thick, and evenly distributed,
not the wild tangle of myth, but a practical coat, as if grown by design. His eyes, deep set beneath that heavy brow, caught the light like amber glass. They were not savage eyes. They were alert, intelligent, even bored. My first thought, perhaps my last truly rational one, was that it had to be a man in costume. The notion was ridiculous, of course, but preferable to the alternative. The costume, if that's what it was flawless. The texture of the hair, the movement of the muscles beneath it, none of that was the stiffness of artifice. It was seamless. A prank? No. Too elaborate. A movie shoot? Impossible. There was no crew, no cameras, and certainly no permits for such nonsense in a refuge. That left only the absurd possibility that the thing was real. My breath came short. I adjusted the focus ring until I could see the fabric of his vest strain against the rise of his shoulders. He adjusted his hard hat, his head, and gestured toward the loader, which groaned as its hydraulics engaged. He turned, catching the sun across his face, and I saw something unexpected. A calm professional satisfaction. The look of a man or creature pleased with the day's progress. Below, the loader paused. The air went still. The foreman's head turned slightly, and I felt rather than saw the shift of his attention. My heart climbed into my throat. For a moment I thought he'd caught me in the reflection of my binoculars. Then he raised his hand and made a simple, unmistakable motion. Palm forward, 2 fingers extended. A quiet signal to wait. He said something to his men. They shut off their saws in unison. The forest, robbed of mechanical noise, seemed to lean closer. And then the impossible foreman, the creature who was not a man, turned his gaze directly toward me and began to walk up the ridge. I dropped flat against the ground, heart hammering, the binoculars pressed to my chest. Each step he took seemed to travel through the earth and into my ribs. The rhythmic hiss of his breathing carried easily across the clearing. Every instinct screamed to run, but another part of me, the columnist, the observer, the man who had built a life on noticing, knew that to move now would be to miss whatever came next. So I lay still in the pine straw, a witness on the edge of revelation, watching the impossible close the distance, one deliberate step at a time. When I first saw him moving toward me, I did what any man of ordinary nerve would do. I froze. There are times when the body takes its own vote and wins. My mind, that steady accountant of facts and probabilities, kept trying to enter numbers that refused to balance. The scene before me wasn't one of fantasy or hallucination. It was too plain for that, too practical. The sun, the machines, the sweat on the backs of the loggers, the smell of diesel, it all conspired to insist on reality. And yet walking toward me up that pine ridge was a figure no biology textbook would sponsor. He was moving with deliberate calm, the long, unhurried stride of a man confident in his footing and in the attention he commanded. His steps left deep impressions in the soft loam. Pine needles stuck to his legs, falling away as he walked, and his shadow stretched impossibly long in the afternoon light. He wasn't running or roaring or acting the part of legend. He was simply approaching, like a foreman coming to inspect an unfamiliar subcontractor. As he came closer, the dimensions of him resolved. My first thought, that he might be wearing some elaborate getup, collapsed under the weight of proximity. No costume fits that well. No prosthetic flexes at the joints. No mask catches sunlight on individual strands of hair. His vest, fluorescent and half unzipped, was the same kind worn by every logging hand from Bastrop to Monticello, except this one looked borrowed from a smaller species. It hung across his chest like a handkerchief and flared open over the kind of shoulders you read about in Scripture. At perhaps 30 feet away, he stopped. He looked at me the way a man looks at a bird that's flown into his shop, mildly curious, not alarmed, and slightly amused that it thought it was hidden.
His face, broad and expressive, was framed by a coarse mane that would have looked unkempt on a man, but seemed right on him. His eyes were the color of amber held to firelight. They had the sort of patience that comes from not needing to explain oneself. I raised the hand out of instinct, meaning to wave or at least signal that I came in peace, but my body overruled me again and locked the motion halfway. The binoculars, now useless, hung from their strap like an accusation. And then, against every rule of physics and common sense, the creature spoke. "Howdy," he said. The voice was a deep baritone, the kind that carries through a church basement or a Friday night fish fry. It had a drawl, our drawl, the long vowels of South Arkansas, rounded by a life spent outdoors. The effect was more disorienting than if he'd roared. "Didn't mean to scare you," he went on, glancing back over his shoulder at the clearing below. "You just admiring our handiwork?" The words arrived like freight, heavy, undeniable, and perfectly ordinary. I blinked, mouth working soundlessly, every prepared explanation crumbling. The Sasquatch, if I can even use that word for something so plainly at ease, was talking to me like a neighbor over a fence. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the landing where the crew was stacking the last of the day's logs. A lot of folks hear logging and think we're just out here tearing things up, clear-cutting everything inside like they did back in the old days. But that ain't what this is. He swung one massive arm in a slow arc. This here's selective cutting, sustainable yield forestry. We're thinning the over-mature stands, taking out diseased trees, reducing fuel load for fire control. It's all part of the plan. I must have made a sound, something between a whimper and a wheeze, because he looked back at me with mild concern. "You all right up there?" I nodded, or at least my neck attempted to motion. The rational part of my brain was still in free fall. I thought this was refuge land." He nodded, as though pleased with my attention to jurisdiction. "Sure is. We're contracted through a stewardship program, working with the Forest Service. They can't get crews in here easy, not on this ground, so they outsource the thinning. We're fully licensed, bonded, and insured. Got a whole plan on file over at Crossett Ranger Station." It was, on the surface, the most reasonable explanation a 9-foot-tall forest creature could offer. "Anyway," he said, crouching down a little so we were nearer eye level, "my name's Darryl." He extended a hand the size of a catcher's mitt, palm forward, friendly as a county fair handshake. My mind, that steady accountant of facts and probabilities, had completely abdicated its duties and handed the decision off to my arm, which extended itself automatically. His hand engulfed mine like a welder's glove. The skin, or fur, or whatever it was, felt coarse but clean, warm with the heat of exertion. His grip was firm, professional. "Ernest," I said, finally finding my voice, though it came out an octave too high. "Pleasure," he said, letting go. "We don't get much foot traffic out this way. You bird watching?" The question, coming from a creature who by all rights should not exist, hit me as almost rude in its normality. Yes," I stammered. "Woodpecker, red-cockaded." He nodded approvingly. "Fine bird. We've been helping their kind out for years, thinning the understory, maintaining the open pine canopy. They need that balance. Most folks don't understand. But conservation and forestry, well, they're the same dance, just different partners." He said it with such matter-of-fact authority that I half expected him to produce a laminated field guide from his vest. The absurdity of it all was staggering. He was a Sasquatch, a myth rendered in muscle and reason, lecturing me about sustainable silviculture. He stood up straight again, casting a shadow that reached nearly to my boots. "There ain't no sense of getting worked up," he said. "We take care of this land, better than most humans, truth be told." And then he smiled. It wasn't a grimace or a baring of teeth, but an honest, modest smile, the kind that says a man is proud of his work and hopes you'll see it the same way. That was when the last of my fear gave way to something stranger. I wasn't terrified anymore. I was embarrassed. Embarrassed at my intrusion, at my binoculars, at my suspicion that the forest belonged to me because I showed up with a notebook and an education. Darryl, because it was now impossible not to think of him by name, turned back toward his crew and waved for him to continue. The chainsaws revved to life again, echoing through the bottoms. "You stick around a bit," he said, glancing back over his shoulder. "I'll show you what we're doing. Might learn something." I sat there in the pine straw for what felt like an hour, my notebook open in my lap, the page empty, except for one line I finally managed to write. "If there's one thing I've learned in 67 years, it's that Arkansans come in two types, the ones who tell you what you didn't ask to know, and the ones who make you ask before they tell you anyway." Darryl Bigfoot, though I hadn't yet decided how to spell his last name, belonged firmly to the first category. Before I could decide whether to run, pray, or write my will in the margin of my field notebook, the matter was settled. One of the human crew below turned, noticed me up on the ridge, and froze mid-step. He jabbed a finger skyward, his mouth moving in slow motion as he said something to the others. I watched as all heads turned. Darryl followed their gaze, eyes squinting against the sunlight. Our eyes met. There are moments in life when every possible path collapses into one, when even a coward can't find a door. That was one of those moments. I braced for a roar or a charge, or perhaps a swift end by way of uprooted pine. But Darryl simply raised one large, fur-covered hand in a slow, unmistakable gesture. "Stay put." He said something to his crew, who immediately went back to work, unbothered. Then, to my disbelief, he began climbing the slope toward me, not like a predator, but like a foreman heading up a bank to check on a survey line. Each step was a geological event. Pine straw shifted, and the slope that would have sent me sliding down on my rear held him like packed concrete. When he reached me, he didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He just said, in that easy cross-it drawl, "Howdy again. You really ought to come down here and see this the proper way. You're liable to get chiggers sitting in that straw." I didn't move. Couldn't. He crouched beside me, the ground protesting under his weight. From up close, the details became unavoidably precise. The way his vest strained across his shoulders, the scent of pine sap mixed with clean sweat and diesel, the faint steam rising from the fur along his forearm. He didn't smell wild. He smelled like a man who'd been working. "Now I know what you're thinking," he said, resting those enormous hands on his knees. "You're thinking we're out here cutting down God's cathedral, ruining what the good Lord built for birds and poets. But I promise you, friend, this is stewardship. Forestry's got a bad name in some circles, but done right, it's the purest form of worship there is." I blinked, unsure if this was real or the after effect of too much caffeine and too little oxygen. He continued unfazed. "See, this here is selective cutting," he said, gesturing toward the clearing below with a sweep of his arm that nearly knocked a pine cone off its branch. "We don't clear cut no more, not since the 20s. We take what needs taken and leave what needs staying. It's all about balance, thinning the stand, letting the sunlight through so your new growth don't choke out. Same principle as pruning a garden, just on a larger scale." His voice had the cadence of a man who'd explained this more times than he cared to, the practiced rhythm of one who knew his subject cold. "A lot of folks think trees get better the longer they live," he said, squinting toward the canopy. "That's true up to a point. Then they start taking more than they give, crowding, competing for light, sucking up nutrients like old men at a church potluck. So we take some out to give the young ones a chance. Fire's part of it too, nature's broom, you might say. But the government don't trust us with much fire anymore." He chuckled, a low rumble that sent ripples through the air. "Course, we still sneak a controlled burn or two when conditions are right. Gotta keep the understory honest." I found myself nodding, absurdly, like a student before a very large, very hairy professor. The lecture continued. "Now over there," he said, pointing to a ridge across the landing, "that stand's been thinned twice since 2010. You can see how straight and clean it is. That's good management. Keeps the basal area around 70-75 square feet per acre. Ideal for growth and wildlife both. We got quail back there now and red-cockaded warblers nesting 2 ridges over. That's proof enough for me that we're doing something right." He looked back at me, brow furrowing slightly. "You're one of them bird folks, ain't you? Binoculars give you away." I managed a faint, "Yes, ornithology." "Thought so." His grin spread wide enough to show a row of surprisingly clean, human-looking teeth. Bird folks usually get it quicker than most. You can't have birds without trees, and you can't have healthy trees without somebody keeping the riffraff in check. Same with people, come to think of it. He stood, stretching, the motion making the surrounding trees seem suddenly undersized. I tell the boys all the time, what we're doing here, this ain't destruction. This is midwifery. We're helping the forest be born again every 50 years or so. There was a conviction in his voice that was hard to argue with. The more he spoke, the less monstrous he became. He wasn't preaching. He was proud. Whatever he was, he loved the woods with a knowledge deeper than most men who wear boots for a living. Below, the crew continued their work in calm rhythm, machines humming, saws buzzing, the loader's arms sweeping logs into orderly piles. Darryl nodded approvingly, as if satisfied his point had been made. "Tell you what," he said, turning back to me, "you stick around, I'll show you the difference between good cutting and bad. I can spot an unhealthy stand from a half-mile away. You can smell it if you know what decay looks like." I opened my mouth to reply, but nothing came out. "Oh, don't worry," he said, clapping one massive hand on my shoulder. The impact was like being tapped by a friendly sledgehammer. "We're a peaceable bunch. Paper and lumber both got to come from somewhere, right? Might as well come from folks who care about what's left behind." He turned to go, his stride carrying him down the slope with the fluid ease of a man who had never once doubted his place on earth. As he rejoined his crew, I sat there in the pine straw, staring down at the clearing, and realized how little I'd understood about the world I thought I knew. I'd come to Felsenthal chasing a bird, and found a form and a myth explaining sustainable forestry better than any graduate seminar could. I wrote in my notebook, hands still trembling from the weight of what I'd seen. Monsters, when properly managed, can make fine stewards. Then I underlined it, twice, because in that moment, I meant it.
In the aftermath of his impromptu lecture, I found myself sitting in a state of suspended disbelief, half paralyzed, half enchanted, with pine straw sticking to my elbows, and a new vocabulary word forming in my head. Adjustment. That was the only way to describe it. The slow, aching stretch of a mind trying to accommodate something it had spent a lifetime dismissing. Darryl stood before me, monumental and unhurried, the light glinting off the reflective tape of his vest. The saws droned faintly below us, the machinery of modern forestry, purring away like civilization itself, refusing to notice what had just happened on this ridge. He shifted his weight, crossing his arms in that patient, managerial way of a man waiting for an underling to find his words. "You look like you seen a ghost, or maybe you are one, the way you sitting there not moving." My voice cracked like a teenage choir boy's. I cleared my throat. "You'll have to excuse me, sir. This is, unanticipated." He grinned, and I swear the forest brightened with it. "You and me both. We don't get a lot of visitors, not ones wearing bicouples anyway." He reached out a hand the size of a catcher's mitt, hairy, yes, but cleaner than any I'd expected, and waited for me to shake it. "Darryl," he said, the syllables thick but familiar, like the name had been spoken 1,000 times before at a church picnic or a Friday fish fry. My own hand, treacherous with adrenaline,
finally detached itself from the rest of me and obeyed. "Ernest," I croaked. "Ernest Opines." He gave my hand a single business-like pump, then released it with surprising gentleness. "Good to meet you proper, Ernest. You're a long way from a highway friend. You lose your bird?" "I was, looking for one, actually. The Red-cockaded Woodpecker." "Well, hell," Darryl said, brightening immediately. "You came to the right spot. That's my bird, too." If there had been a script for this conversation, and there wasn't one, it would have burned up right there in my hand. The absurdity of standing in the Felsenthal bottoms making small talk about endangered species with a 9-foot-tall, fur-covered foreman in a safety vest was beyond any category I'd ever used to organize the world. But Darryl wasn't absurd. He was composed, articulate, and frighteningly normal. He cocked his head toward the clearing below. "Tell me something, Ernest. You know why we're doing all this?" I started to answer, but he was already answering for me. "People see a saw and think destruction. They don't see renewal. That's what kills me about city folks. They read about conservation on a computer made out of plastic and paper, but they think trees just grow straight into cardboard boxes on their own. I've been working this land long enough to know better." He paused, looking off through the tops of the pines. "These woods got memory. You can't fool a pine. You can plant one, water one, coddle one, but it still knows the difference between stewardship and greed. You can feel it when you cut wrong. Trees will tell you if you're working against them." I nodded automatically like a parishioner in church, though I wasn't sure which scripture we were in. Darryl's tone softened. "I get it, though. You come out here with your binoculars and your maps, expecting to find a bird and maybe a story for your column. Instead, you find a logger with too much body hair talking about ecosystem balance." I blinked, startled that he seemed to know me. "You read the Eagle?" He chuckled, a sound halfway between a belly laugh and a landslide. "Every Thursday. Folks out here like to know what the world's saying about 'em. You write good, honest stuff. Bit flowery sometimes, but I ain't judging." There was something profoundly humbling about having one's prose reviewed by a cryptid. He crouched down beside me again, the earth compressing beneath his feet. "See, we've been trying to fix what your great-granddaddy's generation tore up. No offense meant. They did what they had to do. The mills back then were hungry, took every stick they could reach, cut out and got out. Now we got a chance to do better, to grow it back, to manage it right." His voice grew softer, almost reverent. "This land'll forgive you if you listen, but you gotta listen." For a while neither of us spoke. The cicadas had started up in earnest, the air vibrating with their steady pulse. Below, one of the loaders groaned, then settled into idle. A man in a hard hat wiped his forehead and shouted something that Darryl waved away without turning. He stood, stretching, and offered me my hand again, not to shake this time, but to help me up. "Come on, you'll get a better view from the landing. Don't worry, the boys won't bother you. They're used to folks looking at me like I stepped out of a museum diorama." Every sensible instinct screamed at me to decline, but I found myself taking his hand again. He pulled me to my feet as easily as if I were a child, brushing the pine straw off my back with two gentle pats that nearly dislodged my vertebrae. We started down the slope together, him striding, me stumbling, and I noticed the faint rhythmic jingle of metal from his vest pocket. "What's that sound?" I asked before I could stop myself. He grinned. "That, keys to the skidder. Well, you'd think we hotwire these things." At the bottom of the hill, I found myself standing among men who seemed utterly unfazed by their foreman's mythical appearance. One of them nodded politely at me. Another offered a bottle of water. Nobody laughed. Nobody pointed. The normalcy of it all was more surreal than the creature himself. Darryl gestured to the rows of neatly stacked logs. "See that? Directional felling. Every tree laid down with care. None of this knock it over and see where it lands foolishness. We work with gravity, not against it." He looked over at me, eyes crinkling at the corners. "You'd be surprised what a man can learn when he shuts up and watches the trees a while. You riders could use more of that." It wasn't condescending, it was simply true. I stared up at him, afternoon light filtering through the canopy and haloing the edges of his fur in gold. I said, "Darryl," slowly, still testing the name on my tongue, "you're the strangest thing I've ever seen." He grinned again, unoffended. "That's what most folks say about the truth, too." And with that, he turned and called to one of his men, the day's work continuing as though the world had just introduced me to a legend with a forestry degree.
Once we reached the landing, it became clear that the men working under Darryl's command, whatever they thought of his species, treated him with the same matter-of-fact respect due any competent boss. There was a rhythm here, a kind of quiet dignity to the operation, and Darryl, it turned out, had a knack for managing both trees and people. He barked a few instructions to the crew, something about checking the chain tension and flagging a boundary line, and they nodded without hesitation. One man in a hard hat muttered a polite "yes, sir," as though taking orders from a 9-foot Sasquatch were the most natural thing in the world. Darryl turned back to me, brushing sawdust from his vest. "Now, you're probably wondering how a feller like me keeps all this organized," he said, his amber eyes glinting with pride. "I ain't easy managing an outfit this size, not with the feds watching every move. We got to document everything. Acreage, yield, basal area, habitat zones, the whole shebang." He reached into a deep pocket sewn onto the thigh of his work pants, pants that appeared custom tailored by either a forgiving manufacturer or an especially ambitious seamstress, and pulled out an object that gleamed like a mirror in the sunlight. An iPad. Not a modest consumer-grade tablet either. This was the largest, most rugged model Apple made, encased in a black, shock-proof shell with reinforced corners and what appeared to be claw marks etched into the protective film. "You know," he said, turning it over in one massive hand, "I fought this thing for years, said I'd never go digital. Paper maps, clipboards, grease pencils, that's how I came up. Then the Forest Service started sending forms by email only, and I figured it was either evolve or go extinct." He tapped the screen with a thumb roughly the size of a baby's fist. The device came to life instantly, bathing his face in a cold blue light that felt, somehow, both futuristic and prehistoric. "Look-a here," he said, turning it toward me. "This is our whole tract. Got the property lines, timber types, soil composition, and even the RCW buffer zones." Sure enough, a detailed satellite map of the Felsenthal Refuge appeared, annotated with red and green polygons and dotted with specific icons representing specific trees. Darryl zoomed in with a surprisingly delicate pinch of his fingers, the pads of which looked like small throw pillows. "See this layer here?" he said. "That's our stand map. Shows where we've already thinned, where we're due for the next cut. I can mark trees for removal, track yield in real time, and send updates straight to the folks at the ranger station." I peered closer. The screen reflected my own bewildered face next to the faint, hairy outline of his hand. It was like standing in a funhouse mirror of evolution. "Used to be," Darryl went on, "I had to carry one of them big PVC map tubes around. Lost more topo sheets to rain than I care to count. But this is something else. Can pull up rainfall data, soil moisture, NDVI imagery, even endangered species coordinates. Apple really outdid themselves." "You, have Wi-Fi out here?" I asked weakly, trying to bridge the chasm between my understanding of physics and what I was witnessing. He grinned. "Satellite hotspot. Same one the oil field boys use. I get better service here than in Hamburg." He tapped again, pulling up what looked like a detailed spreadsheet. "This here is our cut inventory. Every log over 10 inches in diameter gets tagged, logged, and filed with GPS coordinates. It's accountability, plain and simple. Can't have the state thinking we're freeloading off public land."
He swiped once more, revealing a series of color-coded charts. Now this, he said, is where it gets fun. Growth projections. You put in basal area, average DBH, soil type, and site index, and bam, you get a 20-year yield forecast, all without leaving your truck. He looked at me then, genuinely pleased with himself, as though expecting applause. I obliged with a slow nod. Impressive, I said, which, under the circumstances, felt inadequate. Impressive? He repeated, mock offense softening into laughter. Shoot, Ernest, this is revolutionary. Why, I used to have to write this stuff on the backs of gum wrappers. You try explaining regeneration rates to a logger with a piece of Big Red. Ain't dignified. He tucked the iPad back into his holster as carefully as a minister returning the Bible to the pulpit. Technology gets a bad rep. Folks think it's making us soft. I say it's just making us efficient. It don't matter if you're man or beast. Progress is progress. For a moment he seemed to drift into quiet thought. The air between us hummed with the low growl of idling equipment. I realized I was witnessing something extraordinary. Not a mythic creature rejecting modernity, but embracing it, merging ancient instinct with digital precision. He glanced back at me and grinned. You probably didn't figure Bigfoot for the tech-savvy type, did you? I didn't figure Bigfoot for the real type, I said, before my filter could intervene. He laughed again, a deep, easy sound that made the air tremble. Fair enough, but you gotta understand, there's a lot more of us than folks think. We adapt, always have. My granddaddy used to navigate by stars and coyote calls. Me? I got GIS in a drone. Can't stop the march of progress, brother. Wait, I said, eyebrows climbing. You have a drone? Sure do. Tapped his vest pocket. DJI Mavic. Compact model. Perfect for aerial mapping. You ought to see the footage. Smooth as silk. I'll show you sometime. There are few experiences that can make a grown man feel like his understanding of reality is a small, fragile paper boat adrift in a flood. Standing in the middle of the Felsenthal bottoms, watching a Bigfoot proudly demonstrate satellite mapping software was one of them. Darryl must have sensed my mental tailspin because he gave me a sympathetic look. Don't let it scramble you too bad, Ernest. We're all just learning how to work smarter. You birds, us bipeds, even the humans. You adapt or you go extinct. He said it like a fact, not a threat, and returned his gaze to the screen, adjusting something I couldn't begin to comprehend. Now, he said finally, tucking the iPad away again, are you hungry? We got Vienna sausages and crackers in the cooler. I'd offer you a beer, but OSHA's got opinions. I could only laugh, because by that point, logic had already packed its bags and left.
It's one thing to be confronted by myth in the flesh. It's another to be photographed by it. When Darryl put the iPad away, I thought perhaps our strange meeting had reached its natural conclusion, that he would return to his machines and his men, and I would quietly retreat into obscurity with my sanity only moderately compromised. But Darryl Bigfoot, as I was learning, was not a creature who left moments undocumented. You know, he said, patting the vest pocket where the tablet had disappeared, I like to keep a record of folks who stop by the site. Shows the higher-ups we're maintaining good community relations. Folks love that sort of thing. Engagement, they call it. Community relations, I echoed, though the words didn't seem to fit our present reality. Exactly, he said cheerfully. It's good PR. I figure we might as well get a picture. Before I could register what picture might mean in this context, Darryl had the iPad back out, thumbing it open with a surprising delicacy for hands the size of bread loaves. With one smooth motion, he flipped the camera to its forward-facing position, extended his arm, an appendage that could serve as a respectable crane, and squinted into the glass. All right, he said, turning the device slightly so both of us were framed in the viewfinder. Oh yeah, that's good. Got the loader in the shot. Let's make it look professional. I looked at the screen. What stared back at me was a study in contrast. Darryl, vast, smiling, radiating the confidence of a man at home in his own improbable body, and me standing beside him like a substitute teacher at a monster truck rally, pale, slack-jawed, and visibly reconsidering every decision that had led to this point. "Now," Darryl said, grinning, "on 3, say loblolly." I said nothing. I was still busy trying to understand how my afterlife as a local legend might begin when this photo inevitably found its way online. Darryl counted down, 1, 2, 3, and the iPad emitted a cheerful click, the same polite sound you hear when a tourist photographs a sunset. He lowered the device, looking pleased. "There we go. Nice composition, if I do say so myself." He swiped across the screen and held the image out for me to see. It was worse than I'd feared. There we stood, side by side, Darryl beaming with the easy charm of a man who just nailed his Christmas card photo, and me looking like I'd seen both God and his tax auditor in the same instant. I began, but words failed me. "Like you just met Bigfoot?" Darryl said, finishing my sentence for me. "Well, that's kind of the point, ain't it?" He tapped the image, adding it to a gallery that already contained what looked like dozens of other photos, some with loggers, some with wildlife biologists, one with a bewildered game warden who appeared mid-explanation. "We keep a digital scrapbook," he said proudly. "Shows the history of the company, the people who make it what it is. Can't put a price on goodwill." I watched as he typed something into the caption box with his enormous thumbs. "Good visit with local birder Ernest O. learning about sustainable yield forestry. Great guy, sharp eye for habitat." "There," he said, nodding with satisfaction. "You want me to tag you?" "Tag me?" "Yeah, for the socials. We got Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. Well, I don't personally. The company does. Folks love seeing what we're up to. Human interest, you know." I blinked, trying to picture the headline. "Local newspaper columnist appears in viral photo with mythical log informant." My editor, I suspected, would not find the humor in it. "Maybe just keep that one for the scrapbook," I said, attempting diplomacy. Darryl shrugged. "Suit yourself, but it's a good one. You got kind eyes." He tucked the iPad under one arm, smiling as though we just finished a routine press event. "You'd be surprised, Ernest. A lot of folks think we're shy, but no, Bigfoots are sociable by nature. We just don't like noise, traffic, and people who try to sell us timeshares." He chuckled at his own joke, the sound rolling through the clearing like distant thunder. "Truth is, half of what y'all think you know about us came from movies. We don't throw rocks, we don't eat campers, and we sure as hell don't live in caves. We like open pine, same as your woodpecker." I found myself smiling despite the absurdity of it all. "You seem very grounded." "Well, I gotta be," he said, gesturing to the logging operation. "You can't run a business if you're mystical all the time. I learned that the hard way. Tried submitting my first bid to the state under the name The Legend of Timber, LLC. Didn't get a call back. Changed it to Sasquatch Sustainable Timber, and suddenly everybody wanted a quote." The man had a point. He glanced at the iPad again, then looked at me with mock seriousness. "You mind if I airdrop this to you? It's company policy that all visitors get a copy. Liability reasons." It was my turn to laugh. "Sure, why not? Not like anyone's gonna believe me anyway." He grinned, tapping through the options until my phone appeared on the screen. "There you go. Technology at its finest." A moment later, my pocket buzzed. I pulled out my iPhone, and there it was, the proof of my madness, glowing in perfect resolution. A man and a myth, shoulder to shoulder in the Arkansas pines. "See," Darryl said, clapping me gently on the back. "Now you're part of the story, too." And for the first time that day, I believed him.
After the photo debacle, though Darryl would call it a successful stakeholder engagement, I felt certain our exchange had reached its zenith. I'd been lectured on sustainable forestry by a Sasquatch, schooled on satellite mapping, and photographed like a nervous congressman at a Rotary breakfast. Surely, I thought, there was nowhere else for this encounter to go but silence. But Darryl Bigfoot, as I was learning, was a man of relentless curiosity. He noticed the binoculars hanging around my neck and pointed one long finger toward 'em. "Bird watcher, huh?" he asked, the tone gentle but knowing. "I clocked that when I saw you on the ridge. You had that look." "What look?" I asked, still dazed from the camera flash that had nearly blinded me. "The look of somebody who's seeing more than he's supposed to," he said. "Folks like that always end up out here sooner or later." He leaned back against a stack of cut pine, the logs creaking faintly beneath his weight. "So, what brings you into our neck of the woods? Ain't many birders brave enough to take the tram road. Most stop at the refuge boundary and call it a day." "The red-cockaded woodpecker," I said automatically, my mouth reciting what my brain was too stunned to process. "Picoides borealis." Darryl's expression brightened immediately. "Well, I'll be switched," he said. "You came for the right one." He pushed off the log pile and started pacing slowly, gesturing toward the thinning stands of pine with both hands like a preacher unveiling a new gospel. "You know why we're doing all this work out here? It ain't just for the timber market, it's for those little fellers. This whole tract's managed to suit their needs. Every thinning, every controlled burn, every cavity we preserve, it's all for them." "You mean the woodpeckers?" I asked, trying to keep up. "Course," he said. "They're the reason this land still breathes right." He said it with such conviction that I found myself listening as if for the first time. "See," Darryl went on, "the red-cockaded is a specialist. Don't nest in any old tree. Has to have a live pine, one that's been around a good while, 80, 90 years, maybe more. Needs the heart rot that forms in the older ones. You get too many young trees or too many hardwoods crowding in, and they can't make no home. So what we do is open it up, let the sunlight in, create those longleaf and loblolly savannas they favor. Give 'em space to breathe, same as folks need in a crowded town." I was struck dumb by his familiarity with the details. This wasn't the idle talk of a hobbyist. He knew the Latin names, the silvicultural requirements, the management protocols that only appear in research memos and Forest Service handbooks. You're saying you manage logging operations for woodpeckers?" "Among other things," he said with a shrug. "Gotta keep balance, Ernest. Timber pays the bills, but the land's gotta live after we're gone. I can't feed my family on guilt. So we cut clean, we cut smart, and we leave it better than we found it." He crouched beside me, and his tone softened into something closer to pride. "Now them little birds ain't much to look at, but they're engineers, same as us. You ever seen one excavate a cavity?" "Not in person," I admitted. "Beautiful thing," he said reverently. "They pick a longleaf, usually one with that resin flow. They'll chip it all day, week after week, until they've got a neat little chamber carved right in the heartwood. Sap oozing down the trunk, deterring snakes. That's craftsmanship, Ernest. That's art." He sighed, folding his arms again, his massive chest rising and falling. "You ever notice how people will spend their whole lives studying birds and still think they're the smart ones? Truth is, nature's been doing this longer than we've been paying attention. We just got the paperwork." I couldn't help but laugh, a small, incredulous sound. "You talk like a philosopher." He smiled, eyes crinkling. "Nah, just a forester who's paid attention. You spend 100 years hiding in the trees, you pick up on a few things." He turned back toward the thinning stand of pine, shading his eyes with one enormous hand. "You hang around till dusk, I'll show you where they're nesting. We got a cavity over that ridge, male and female both. He brings her grubs every evening, right about sundown. You can set your watch to it." Something shifted in me at that moment, as though the absurd had finally tipped into the profound. I had come to the Felsenthal bottoms to catch a glimpse of a rare bird. Instead, I had found a living impossibility who loved that same bird more deeply and with greater practical understanding than I ever could. "Darryl," I said quietly, "how do you know all this?" He grinned and tapped the side of his head. "Continuing education, my friend. We got a whole network. Forest techs, biologists, sometimes even a grad student or two. You'd be amazed what a fella can learn just sitting in the tree line listening to people who don't know you're there. That mental image of Bigfoot attending night classes by osmosis might have been funny if it hadn't made such perfect sense. You ever think about telling someone?" I asked, the question tumbling out before I could stop it. He chuckled softly. "Tell 'em what? That Bigfoot's running a timber company and managing endangered habitat in his spare time? Folks don't want to hear that. They like their monsters simple. Keeps the world tidy." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. A distant woodpecker hammered somewhere to the east, and Darryl's expression softened again. "That's him," he said, nodding toward the sound. "Male. He's got a rhythm to him, don't he? 3 short taps, 1 long. Been hearing that family for 2 seasons now. They're doing fine." He looked down at me and smiled, as if to say he knew exactly what was going through my head. "You came looking for a bird, but what you really found was proof that maybe the world still takes care of itself when folks ain't looking." There wasn't much I could add to that. I just stood there listening to the faint tapping echoed through the pines, and for the first time that day, I didn't feel like I was intruding.
There's a strange intimacy in technology. For all its coldness, its circuitry and glass, it has a way of turning the improbable into the routine. I'd already been given more proof of the impossible than a man deserves in one lifetime. But when Darryl Bigfoot asked if I had airdrop turned on, I realized I'd crossed into new theological territory. "Tell you what," he said, fishing that oversized iPad out again, "I'll send you that selfie we took. You'll want to show somebody eventually. And I got a few photos of the woodpecker family you'll appreciate. Took 'em myself last week. Crystal clear. Even got the male bringing in a grub." He said this the way a man might offer a neighbor some extra okra from the garden. Friendly, routine, utterly sane. I nodded dumbly, fumbling for my phone. My hands were shaking, either from adrenaline or disbelief, and my thumb nearly opened my bank app instead. "Go on and turn on your airdrop there," Darryl instructed, as if this were the most natural thing 2 living species could do. "You'll see me pop up in a second." Sure enough, a notification appeared. Darryl Bigfoot would like to share 4 photos. For a man who had entered the forest to observe birds, I had not expected to leave it with a photographic record of my meeting with an undocumented primate, and high resolution at that. I tapped accept, and a small progress bar began to fill. "There she goes," he said, smiling proudly. "Technology's a miracle, ain't it? I used to have to mail Polaroids to the district office. Now I just beam 'em through the air. Whole world's connected if you know which buttons to push." The first image loaded. The selfie. I winced. My expression, wide-eyed, slack-jawed, one eyebrow mid-spasm, looked like a man midway through an existential crisis. Darryl, on the other hand, looked radiant. His smile was all confidence and good humor, his fur reflecting the sunlight like polished copper. The fluorescent vest practically glowed. Below that came a sequence of 3 stunning wildlife photographs, close-ups of a red-cockaded woodpecker perched on the lip of its cavity, the male delicately passing a grub to the female. The clarity was professional. There was depth of field, composition, even proper exposure.
"You took these?" I asked. "Course," he said. "Canon R5 with a 600mm lens. You think these hands can't work a camera? I got steady aim. One perk of a low heart rate." He chuckled, scrolling through a few more images before tucking the iPad under his arm again. "I like to document the progress. Helps me keep track of which cavities are active and which ones got abandoned. We turn all that data over to the state. Transparency's important." I opened the last file he'd sent, a digital contact card. It was somehow the strangest part of all. Darryl Bigfoot, CEO/Chief Forester, Sasquatch Sustainable Timber Limited. Phone 870-555-0197. Email darryl@sasquatchtimber.com. Website www.sasquatchtimber.com. Instagram @SasquatchTimber. Below that was a small company logo, a silhouette of a Bigfoot holding a chainsaw against a rising sun, with the tagline, "Rooted in Conservation." "You have a website?" I managed. "Sure do. Built it myself on Squarespace. Well, me and my niece. She's good with computers. We get a lot of hits from Oregon and Washington. Folks love the name, though we don't ship past the Mississippi. Freight costs will eat you alive." He was dead serious. "You're telling me you run a LLC?" "Registered in Ashley County, yes, sir. Got my EIN, my insurance, my continuing education certificates, and my Better Business Bureau accreditation. We're small, but we're solvent." He leaned a little closer, lowering his voice as though confiding a trade secret. "We even got a feller at the chamber. Don't ask too many questions, bless him." My phone buzzed again. Another airdrop. This one was a short video clip. I tapped play. It showed Darryl himself standing at the base of a pine tree with a small team of human loggers, describing the difference between habitat thinning and clear cutting. His voice was calm, professional, and undeniably human in tone. The camera panned up to show a cavity tree, sunlight spilling through the high canopy. It looked like a training video for the U.S. Forest Service. "That's for the socials," he said. "We post once a week. Folks like seeing a Bigfoot who can string a sentence together. It's good for morale." I didn't know whether to laugh or fall to my knees. "You're on Instagram?" "@Sasquatch Timber," he beamed. 15,000 followers and climbing. I got foresters from as far as Maine asking about my thinning ratios. It's humbling, really." He paused for a moment, then looked at me kindly. "You want me to tag you when I post that selfie? We usually get good engagement on Fridays." The absurdity had reached such an altitude that it was now indistinguishable from grace. I laughed out loud. Real laughter, the kind that shakes the last of the fear out of you. "Sure, Darryl, tag away." He grinned, tapping the side of his iPad with one great thumb. "That's the spirit. You keep an open mind, Ernest. The world'll surprise you. Always has, always will." And there it was again, that strange, gentle wisdom, tucked inside the wildest day of my life. I looked at the glowing image of us on my phone, the impossible made ordinary, and thought, maybe this is what discovery looks like now. Not revelation, but reception. Darryl clapped me on the back, nearly dislocating something. "Now you're part of the network," he said with pride. "Welcome to modern forestry."
Every story worth its salt eventually drifts off topic, and Darryl Bigfoot, like any Southern man with a lifetime of anecdotes, was not immune to the gravitational pull of a good digression. It began innocently enough, with me asking how often he worked these tracks, but soon veered into a full-blown treatise on the occupational hazards of forestry in the Felsenthal bottoms. "Well," he began, settling himself onto a stump that cracked faintly under his weight, "I tell folks all the time, the hardest part of this job ain't the weather, or the machinery, or the government red tape, it's the wildlife." "The wildlife?" I echoed. He nodded solemnly.
Yes, sir. Now, I love God's creatures as much as the next mammal, but some of them seem to have been designed specifically to test my patience. He leaned back, one arm draped casually across his knee, the picture of a man, or beast, about to spin a story. Take, for instance, the alligator. 10-foot reptiles, full of teeth and bad decisions. They love these bottoms. You can't dig a drainage ditch or clean out a culvert without one moving in like it's beachfront property. I must have looked skeptical, because he smiled. You think I'm exaggerating? Let me tell you about last spring. We were trying to clear a clogged culvert off the main access road down near a slough that feeds into the Ouachita. Water had backed up bad after that April rain, so we rolled the skidder down to pull the debris out. Well, we get there, and what do we find? A gator, big as the tailgate on a dually, just sitting in that pipe like he paid rent. What did you do? I asked, half out of horror, half out of curiosity. Same thing any sane man would do, he said, deadpan. We tried to reason with him. He paused for effect, letting the silence hang just long enough to draw a laugh from me before continuing. Didn't go well. He hissed, we hissed back. Nobody budged. You can't move a gator that don't want to move. They're like union workers with scales. He chuckled, shaking his head. We threw skicks, we banged on the culvert. Feller tried riving the skidder just to scare him off, but that only made him madder. He lunged at the tire. We lost half a morning playing tug-of-war with a prehistoric lawsuit. I couldn't help myself. I was laughing now, a deep, disbelieving laugh that felt like release. Darryl grinned. Finally, I told the boys he's not moving unless he gets something better to do. So we baited him. Left a deer carcass when we found hit on the road about 50 yards downstream. Took him less than 5 minutes to sniff it out and go after it. Cleared that culvert right up. You're joking. He looked genuinely offended. Ernest, I don't joke about workflow efficiency, but I did have to expense the deer. You ever tried putting alligator bait on a tax report? My accountant about had a stroke. I nearly choked on my own laughter. Darryl shook his head like a man who had seen too much. That's just one example. You got beavers flooding haul roads, cottonmouths in the toolboxes, raccoons raiding the lunch coolers, and armadillos that dig under the equipment at night. The forest don't take a day off, brother. Every critter out here's got its own agenda. He grew thoughtful for a moment, gazing out across the clearing where the pines swayed in the afternoon breeze. But I tell you something, he said softly. As aggravating as they can be, I'd rather deal with them than people any day. You know where you stand with a gator. People, they're the unpredictable ones. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, the picture of a man, or beast, about to spin a story. Last year we had a state inspector come out here, city boy, new boots, fancy drone, thought he was walking into Jurassic Park. Every time a twig snapped, he near about jumped into my arms. I told him, son, the scariest thing in this swamp is your supervisor. He didn't laugh. Some folks just ain't built for field work. Clearly you are, I said. Well, I've had practice, and longer legs. He chuckled again, a deep, easy rumble that blended with the drone of cicadas and distant equipment. See, Ernest, that's the thing about this job. It keeps you humble. You start thinking you're in charge out here, and a 12-foot reptile will remind you real quick who's running things. He picked up a twig, turning it thoughtfully between his fingers. Truth is, though, the swamp don't mean you harm. It just don't care about your schedule. You got to learn to work with it, not against it. Same goes for people, come to think of it. There it was again, that flash of plain-spoken wisdom disguised as humor. You ever get scared? I asked. Only when I stop paying attention. The woods will forgive mistakes, but it won't forget 'em. You can quote me on that in your column. I nodded, scribbling a note in the margin of my field pad, though I knew even then it was a quote I couldn't use. Who would believe a Bigfoot capable of humor, empathy, and tax-deductible problem-solving? Now that covert gator, we named him Carl. He comes back every few months. I think he likes the company. You might say we've reached a professional understanding. He smiled, all teeth and good nature. Everybody needs a workplace nemesis, Ernest. Keeps you sharp." And with that, he turned toward the ridge to check on his men, leaving me alone with my notebook, my laughter still echoing in the timber, and the slow dawning realization that wisdom often arrives wearing huddy boots, or in this case, none at all.
By that point in the afternoon, I had already accepted a few facts that would have gotten me laughed out of any respectable civic club meeting in Ashley County. 1, Bigfoot existed. 2, he had a fully functioning limited liability company. And 3, perhaps the most unsettling revelation of all, he understood the timber market better than anyone I'd ever met across the Chamber of Commerce. It started innocently enough with me asking a throwaway question about tree identification. "What are those over there?" I said, pointing toward a clump of trees whose bark flaked off in thick, curling strips. "Sweet gum," Darryl said immediately, glancing at him like a man sizing up an old rival. "Fine trees, straight, quick to grow, and good shade if you like staring at something useless." "Useless?" I asked. "Well, maybe that's unfair," he said, crossing his arms and leaning against a pine stump. "They've got their place, make good pulp, but the market's soft right now. Mills are full. Can't get top dollar for gum when the paper folks are choked up with inventory. Now pine, that's where the action is." I must have raised an eyebrow because he smiled, warming to the subject like a preacher whose favorite verse had just been requested. "Loblolly," he said reverently. "That's the backbone of this whole region. You can tell the health of South Arkansas by the price of a truckload of loblolly saw timber. When it's up, men are buying bass boats. When it's down, they selling them." He picked up a pine cone from the ground, rolled it in his massive palm, and looked at it like a banker inspecting a gold coin. "Sweet gum's like that cousin who shows up late and eats all the potato salad. It fills in where pine ain't watching, but pine's where your real yield is. Fast growing, straight trunk, light on resin, but heavy on strength. The good stuff, that old fat pine, that's long gone. But this," he tossed the cone into the woods, "this is the modern miracle. Managed right, it's renewable profit." I stared at him, unable to decide which was more improbable, his species or his economics. "You seem to know quite a bit about forestry markets," I said carefully. "Well, I read," he replied simply. "You'd be amazed what you can learn from trade journals and a decent Wi-Fi connection. Plus, I keep an eye on the quarterly reports. Georgia Pacific, Weyerhaeuser, Drax, if they sneeze, the whole southern timber belt catches cold." He bent down, drew a rough graph in the dirt with one thick finger, and began giving me an impromptu lecture that would have impressed any forestry economist from Monticello to Baton Rouge. "See, pulpwood prices fluctuate with fuel costs, 'cause freight is the hidden killer. You're not selling wood, you're selling mileage. If diesel's high, your break-even point moves up the road faster than a dog with a tick. That's why we try to keep the local. Cut, mill, and haul within 50 miles if you can help it. Otherwise, your profit margin turns into confetti." He straightened, dusting his hands off. "Now hardwoods, oak, hickory, and gum, they temperamental. They don't like to be rushed. You get a decent veneer tree once in a while, but mostly it's pulp. And the buyers want clean, uniform fibers these days. Sweet gum's a little too coarse for that. But loblolly," he grinned, "loblolly's money on the stump." The wind shifted, carrying the resinous scent of fresh-cut pine through the clearing. Darryl inhaled deeply. "That smell right there, that's the smell of a good quarter. Smells like payroll and diesel." "You sound like a man who's been reading the commodities section," I said, still trying to ground myself in this new reality. He chuckled. "You think I don't have a Bloomberg app? I track futures same as anybody else. Timber, resin, even carbon credits. They're the new frontier, you know. Pretty soon folks will be getting paid just to keep trees standing. Makes you think, don't it?" I had to admit, it did.
Darryl's tone softened and he knelt beside one of the stumps. "You see this grain," he said, tracing it gently with one clawed fingertip. "This was about 50 years old. Good density, straight trunk. We'll replant here within a month. By the time your grandkids are complaining about gas prices, this will be ready to harvest again. That's what I love about this business. Time moves in rotations, not news cycles." He looked up at me then, eyes bright beneath his heavy brow. "You think lumber's about destruction, but it's really about patience. You don't own the land. You borrow it from the next fella that's going to work it." It was an oddly poetic statement coming from a creature with forearms like telephone poles. "You ever think about what you could have done if you'd been born human?" I asked, immediately regretting the phrasing. Darryl smiled, not offended but amused. "Ernest, I'm human enough where it counts. I got a mortgage, an insurance premium, and a stack of invoices that don't pay themselves. Besides, I like what I do. There's nobility in building something that lasts longer than you." He stood, looking out over the thinning pine stand. "You keep the trees healthy, the forest keeps you fed. That's the oldest economy in the world." Then, as if sensing he'd gotten too philosophical, he added with a wink, "And besides, nobody ever made a living off sweet gum." He threw back his head and laughed, a deep, rumbling laugh that made the forest seem suddenly lighter. I joined him, though whether from humor or sheer wonder I couldn't say. If there's one thing I took away from that moment, it was this: the forest, like the truth, doesn't care who tells it, only that someone does. And Darryl Bigfoot, improbable as he was doing it justice.
If you spend enough time in the company of loggers, preachers, or philosophers, and Darryl Bigfoot was somehow all three, you'll eventually end up talking about what's underfoot. For most men, that means roots or mud. For Darryl, it meant geology. It happened in one of those late afternoon lulls that feel like the forest itself taking a breath. The crew had gone quiet, the saws idling low, the loader's diesel sighing as it cooled. We stood on a narrow ridge above a slough, the air thick with the smell of sap and sun-baked pine. I made some idle remark about how dry the soil looked, trying to sound like I still knew what was real. "Been dry," I said, "awful dry." "Sure has," Darryl replied, bending down to pinch a handful of earth. The grain slipped through his massive fingers like sugar. "Good for the machines, bad for the trees, and dangerous too. This kind of soil'll burn clean through to the roots if it ever catches." He looked up at me, his eyes serious now, his tone turning to lecture. "You know why it's like this? All this sandy loam out here? That's earthquake dirt." "Earthquake dirt?" I asked. He nodded. "From the New Madrid fault. You ever read about it?" I had, vaguely, some dim recollection of a high school geography lesson, something about the Mississippi running backward once upon a time. But hearing it invoked by a 9-foot-tall forestry expert in the middle of the Arkansas bottoms gave it a peculiar weight. "Most folks don't think about it," Darryl said, tossing the sand aside, "but them big quakes in 1811 and 1812 changed everything. Ground shook for months. Whole forests sunk. Rivers jumped their banks and carved new ones. The way I heard it, some places liquefied so bad that the earth started spitting sand like geysers. That's what they call sand blows. We're standing on one right now." He stamped a heavy foot and a puff of dust rose. "This ground ain't solid. It's been moving longer than we've been breathing. You build a road wrong out here or set your equipment without knowing what's under you, the whole thing'll slump like a sponge. Most fellas don't even realize the fault line runs right under half this county. She's sleeping for now, but the day she rolls over, folks'll remember who's boss." He looked off toward the horizon, where the land stretched flat and endless, a quilt of green and gold under the lowering sun. His voice dropped lower, almost reverent. You can still feel it sometimes, late at night when the wind dies, the ground hums. Not loud, just a low tremor, like the memory of what it did once. This land's old, Ernest, older than any of us got words for. Ain't just dirt, it's a record. It was one of those moments where conversation stopped being about words and became something closer to worship. He scooped another handful of sand, letting it run slow between his fingers. You see this? That right there is the ghost to mountains. Once upon a time, this was high country. Then the water came and it all settled. That's the thing about the earth. It don't disappear. It just rearranges itself. I scribbled something in my notebook, not quite sure what I was recording anymore. Darryl straightened, brushing his hands together. Now, most loggers don't bother with geology, but it matters. You can't manage a forest if you don't understand the bones it's growing on. This here's porous soil, drains fast, don't hold nutrients. That's why pine likes it. Hardwood hates it. But down closer to the river, where the alluvium's thick, that's where your oaks thrive. Land tells you what it wants if you know how to listen. He smiled faintly. My granddaddy used to say the earth was alive. I used to think he meant that poetic. Turns out he meant it literal. You mean earthquakes? I asked. He means everything, he said simply. Roots talk. Water moves like blood. Fungi carry messages underground. You got more communication happening down there than you got on the internet. People call it science now. My folks just called it common sense. He walked a few steps, crunching the dry soil beneath his feet. This hill is don't belong, or a creek that runs crooked for no reason. That's the land remembering something. The old one said you could feel it humming before the shake ever hit. Some nights when the crickets stop, I swear I still hear it. I believed him. Maybe it was the tone, or maybe the way the light caught in the resin on the bark, glowing like the land itself was breathing. But for a moment, I felt it too, a faint vibration underfoot, steady as a heartbeat. Doesn't that worry you? I asked quietly. Living on a fault line? He shrugged. Everywhere is a fault line if you live long enough. Ground shifts, people move on, you just build smart, keep your eyes open, and respect what's older than you. He looked out toward the tree line again, where the first stars were flickering above the canopy. Truth is, Ernest, that's what forestry really is, managing movement. Trees fall, rivers shift, soil gives way. We just learn to bend with it. Folks who fight it end up in sinkholes. He grinned, the philosopher giving way again to the foreman. Of course, if the New Madrid ever does wake up, all this will be breached land property. Might finally raise land values in Ashley County. I laughed in spite of myself, and he joined me, his laughter rolling across the woods like distant thunder. We stood there a while longer, silent, but companionable, the sound of cicadas rising in waves. Somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called, and the earth, quiet, old, patient, held us up.
Every great conversation in the woods eventually turns to ghosts. By that, I don't mean the kind that rattle chains or haunt attics. I mean the ones that flicker in the edge of memory, half believed, half denied, and too proud to go quietly. In the South, we call them ivory-billed woodpeckers. It happened as the day began to lean toward evening. The work noise faded, the crew had shut down the feller buncher, and a soft quiet rolled back over the bottoms. The air was cooler, fragrant with pine sap and sawdust. I was still thinking about Darryl's impromptu geology lecture when the subject shifted back to birds, the way rivers curve back to their source. Speaking of rare things, I said, you ever see an ivory bill out here? Campophelus principalis? The reaction was immediate, a low barking laugh that rumbled up from somewhere deep in his chest. "The Lord God bird," he said, shaking his head. "Son, that's a ghost story." He grinned, but there was sympathy in it. "You bird folks always want that one, don't you? Chasing the miracle instead of the message." "You don't believe they're gone?" I asked. "Oh, I believe they're gone," he said simply. "My great-granddaddy saw 'em, said they made a sound like a child's toy trumpet, bright and sharp, like the woods was laughing at you. But that was a long time ago, before the big cut, before we stripped out the old-growth bottomland those birds needed. Once them giant oaks and cypress went, so did the ivory bills. Ain't been enough wild wood left for 'em since Coolidge was president." He turned toward the darkening pines, eyes narrowing. "Now, every few years, somebody claims a sighting. Blurry photo, shaky video, some professor on the news saying we might have rediscovered 'em. Folks want it to be true. I get that, but wanting don't make something live again." There was no arrogance in his tone, just the kind of practicality that comes from decades of observation. "You think they're extinct then?" I asked. "I think they moved on," he said. "World changes. Species change with it, or they don't. That's not tragedy. That's the rule. Only people got the arrogance to think loss means failure. The forest don't mourn, Ernest. It just adapts." He crouched beside a pine stump, running a finger along the growth rings. "See this? 100 years ago, this whole ridge was water. 10 years from now, it'll be young timber again. The only thing permanent in this line of work is turnover." I watched him for a moment, the lowering sun catching the tips of his fur like bronze wire. "You sound like you made your peace with that." "He had to," he said. "Can't run a business or a life on nostalgia. Don't mean I don't respect it, though. The ivory bill was something special. Bold bird. Didn't hide like the rest. They say when it flew, it looked like a piece of the sky had come loose." He smiled faintly, his voice softening. "But you can't build a future on ghosts. You got to work with what's still breathing. That's why we managed for the red-cockaded bird. That bird's still fighting, still got skin in the game. Folks like to chase legends. I'd rather protect survivors." That line stuck with me. There was a quiet wisdom in it that felt almost scriptural. Maybe that's the problem. We don't know how to let things go. Darryl nodded. "That's a human disease. You grieve the loss, but forget to thank what's left. Every year I plant 50,000 new seedlings. They won't see maturity till long after I'm gone, but that's how you cheat extinction. You plant faith in the ground." He looked up at the dimming sky, where a red-tailed hawk was circling lazily over the pines. "You know, folks act like the world ended when that last ivory bill died. But look around. These loblollies, these woodpeckers, this soil, they're proof the story ain't finished yet." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The forest was settling into its evening posture. A breeze moved through the canopy, rattling the needles like soft applause. I thought of all the myths humanity had buried in these woods, some dead, some merely hiding. "You ever wonder," I asked, "if maybe the ivory bill didn't go extinct so much as decide to quit being seen?" Darryl grinned. "Now there's a thought. Maybe he's smarter than the rest of us. I tried that once myself. Didn't work out. Got dragged into business filings and OSHA meetings." We both laughed, though his eyes lingered on the horizon a beat longer than the joke required. "You're a strange man, Darryl," I said, and he looked back at me, smiling just enough to prove he'd heard the compliment under the disbelief. "Maybe," he said, "but I'm real. The ivory bill ain't. Best you keep your eyes on what's left to save." And with that, he turned toward the loader, calling for his men to start securing equipment for the night. As I watched him move through the dying light, massive yet careful, I thought, there was a time when men believed in monsters because they feared them. Now I believed in one because he cared more than most men I knew. The woods, that great cathedral of loss and regeneration, seemed to agree. Somewhere in its shadowed choir, a real woodpecker tapped faintly, a small, insistent hymn for the living.
Dusk in the bottomlands comes with a kind of grace that doesn't belong to any clock. It doesn't so much arrive as seep in, first through the treetops, then across the bark, then into the hollows of your thoughts. The light thins like honey, and the sounds soften. Even the machines, those growling children of industry, know when to quiet down. That's how the day ended with Darryl Bigfoot. The loader went still, its hydraulic arms folding like a praying mantis at rest. The saws coughed once, then died. One by one, the crew gathered their things, stacking gear and closing toolboxes with the unspoken rhythm of men who'd done this many times before. A whippoorwill started up somewhere in the shadows, and the pine needles caught the last bit of gold before giving in to gray. "Well, Ernest," Darryl said, his tone neither sentimental nor abrupt, "that's about a wrap." He reached out one enormous hand, the same hand that had held an iPad, a chainsaw, and for one brief moment, my understanding of the world. "Been a pleasure working beside you today." "I didn't do much work," I said. He grinned. "You listened. That's rare enough." I shook his hand. It was like gripping a bundle of braided cables wrapped in suede, solid, grounded, alive. I had expected it to be cold, but it wasn't. It was warm, almost comforting, like shaking hands with an uncle you hadn't seen since childhood. He reached into the pocket of his vest and pulled out something small and laminated. "Here," he said, pressing it into my palm, "for future reference." I looked down. It was a business card. A business card. Sasquatch Sustainable Timber, LLC. Darryl Bigfoot, CEO, Chief Forester. Licensed, bonded, and insured. Phone number 870-555-0197 and a website, www.sasquatchtimber.com. The company logo, his silhouette, chainsaw in hand against the rising sun, looked almost noble in the fading light. "Are you kidding me?" I said, unable to help myself. He shook his head, earnest as a deacon. "You'd be surprised how many folks ask for quotes. We do selective cutting, habitat management, consultation, reclamation, whole package. Paperwork's the hardest part, but that's the price of progress." "Who's your accountant?" I asked. "My niece. Knows QuickBooks better than I know my own blood pressure. Keeps me out of trouble." He said it was such normalcy that the absurdity circled back around to truth. Behind him, the men were already loading the last of the tools. One waved as they climbed into the pickup. "See you tomorrow, boss." "Take it easy, fellas. Don't forget to grease that loader arm before morning. She's been squeaking again." He turned back to me, smiling faintly. "Good crew, salt to the earth. Ain't a man among 'em who would ever say a word about what they seen today. Not 'cause they're scared, just 'cause they don't see the point. Some things don't need proving, just doing." The last light drained from the ridge, leaving us in a comfortable twilight. For the first time all day, I noticed how natural it felt to stand beside him. The initial fear, the tremor of disbelief, had faded into something closer to respect. "What'll you do tomorrow?" I asked. "Same thing I do every day. Cut a few trees, check on the birds, try to keep the wheels from falling off the world. It's honest work." He looked toward the dark line of the trees, where the forest seemed to open itself like a door. "We all got our part to play. Some of us just drew the hairier lot." I laughed, though it came out quieter than I intended.
"You'll be out here again?" He nodded. "Always. You just won't see me unless you're looking right." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he gave a small nod, the kind of nod men give when there's nothing left to say that hasn't already been said by the day itself. He turned and started toward the tree line, his stride unhurried, his silhouette framed by the last lavender streaks of dusk. The crew's headlights flickered once, then went dark, swallowed by the woods. At the edge of the forest, Darryl paused. He looked back over his shoulder, that faint grin still playing on his face. "Remember what I told you, Ernest. Manage the land, and it'll manage you right back." Then he lifted one hand in a casual farewell and stepped into the shadows. There was no sound, no crashing, no snapping branches, no cinematic rustle. He was simply gone. The clearing seemed to hold its breath, then exhale. A single barred owl called out in the distance as if signaling the changing of the guard. I stood there for a while, staring at the place where he had vanished, the business card still warm in my hand. Its edges were crisp, the ink fresh, the laminate glossy. I turned it over in the dim light and read the words again. Licensed, bonded, and insured. That detail, so bureaucratic, so boring, felt like the truest proof of all. The night pressed in, soft and blue. Somewhere in the pines, a loader's engine ticked as it cooled. A small, metallic heartbeat in a world that was otherwise mythic and still. When I finally started back toward my side-by-side, I felt the day behind me like a weight, a good weight, the kind a man carries when he's seen something honest and impossible at the same time. And as the forest swallowed me too, I realized that Darryl Bigfoot, logging foreman, philosopher, and steward of the Felsenthal bottoms, had taught me more about faith than any preacher ever had. Faith, like forestry, wasn't about what you believed, it was about what you tended. There's a kind of silence that comes after something too strange to tell. It doesn't arrive all at once. It settles like sawdust after the last cut of the day, sifting down over everything you thought you knew. That was the silence I drove home in. The sun had dropped completely by the time I reached the Tacoma. The woods were full of evening smoke and insect song. I loaded the Pioneer onto the trailer with a steadiness that felt rehearsed, though my mind was far from it. The straps ratcheted tight, the lights clicked on, and I began the slow crawl up the gravel road towards civilization, or something like it. The first stars were out by the time I hit Highway 82. The sky above the pine line was turning that shade of indigo that makes you forget the day was ever bright. Every now and then a reflection flashed on the windshield, something in the glass catching the shape of the woods behind me. I told myself it was headlights from another car. There were no other cars. By the time I passed the city limit sign for Crossit, I'd rehearsed every version of the story I could never tell. Each draft died before it made it out of my mouth. "I met Bigfoot in the Felsenthal bottoms" is not a sentence that gets you invited to Rotary breakfasts. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked as it always did, brick quiet, porch light still on, the faint hum of the air conditioner fighting back the October damp. I unloaded nothing. I just went inside, washed the grit off my hands, and made a pot of coffee I didn't need. In my study, the lamp cast that warm, forgiving light that makes even foolish men feel scholarly. My typewriter sat in its usual place, flanked by my laptop and a small collection of bird guides. On the wall hung a photograph of the Rose Inn, its white columns glowing like memory itself. I sat down, opened a new document, and stared at the blinking cursor, that little metronome of expectation. This, I thought, is what separates truth from story. A blank page can hold either, but never both. I had proof. The selfie glowed on my phone, Darryl and me, immortalized in pixels. Behind us, the pines stood like witnesses. His grin was huge, confident, impossibly human. My own face looked like a man trying to process divine revelation with a public school education. And yet I couldn't do it. I couldn't type the words that would make it real. The truth was too large for print, too strange for publication. Even if I wrote it exactly as it happened, every sight, every word, no one would believe it. They'd say I'd gone soft in the head, that I'd gone out in the woods and found religion. Maybe I had. For a long time, I just sat there, listening to the house hum. The coffee went cold. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice, then stopped. I thought of Darryl's parting words. Manage the land, and it'll manage you right back. He was right. The woods weren't something to escape or conquer. They were a ledger, recording what was taken, what was given, what was remembered. And that day I had taken something intangible, something that couldn't be milled, sold, or printed. Belief, redefined. I opened the file again and typed the headline, "On the proper method for winterizing a two-stroke lawnmower." It was the kind of topic readers expected from me. Harmless, instructive, uncontroversial. Nobody ever questioned a man who talked about engines. I looked at the phone again at the impossible photograph and smiled. Then I set it face down beside the keyboard, the screen dimming into nothing. Some truths are not meant for the page. They belong to the living, to the quiet covenant between those who've seen and those who never will. Maybe that's how the world stays stitched together, by the restraint of those who know too much and write too little. I typed the first line of the new column. The words came easy. They always did when the subject was small and manageable. But my mind stayed somewhere deeper, under the canopy, where moonlight hit bark like silver and the air smelled of sap and diesel. When I finished, I sat back, the page clean and harmless, ready for print. The cursor blinked again, patient as ever, as if asking if I wanted to tell the real story now. "No," I said aloud to no one. "Not tonight." I closed the laptop, turned off the lamp, and let the room fall into darkness. Outside, the woods waited, unchanged, untroubled, and utterly indifferent to belief. Somewhere out there, a great lumbering shape might have been moving through the pines, steady and unseen, checking on the regrowth, keeping balance as he said he would. And in that moment, I decided that was enough. The story would remain untold, because the truth, like the forest, sometimes lives best in the quiet.